go ahead and show your screen anytime.
Okay, let's see. Okay, everyone's seeing the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Tileston Mill spur. And kind of covers the general kind of about where it is, what it was, why I'm interested in it. Then we'll talk about kind of 3 periods in history: the early history, when the spur was first built and a lot of additions were made; the middle years, when things were kind of fading away; and then the late years, where it became much more active again. A little bit about operations on the spur, and then a brief section on just how I'll plan on modeling it on my layout. So where's the Tileston Mill spur? It's actually located in St. Cloud, Minnesota. And for those of you not familiar with Minnesota, it's about 60 miles northwest of Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's on the Osseo line, the 3rd subdivision of the Willmar Division. What is it? Well, basically it's a 3-mile spur that leaves the main line at milepost 59.08, which is about 3.5 miles east of the St. Cloud Depot. And it heads railroad west, geographically that's north. Basically, it heads from the bluffs where the main line is down to the river level. And if here's the Mississippi River coming through, there's a dam here. In relation to the yards were up here, and the crossing of the river, the railroad crossing the river was north up here. The spur came down to the basically just above river level. And so it dropped 37 feet in elevation, and it serves industries located near the river there, and then a couple other things along the spur. Why am I interested in it? Well, as you probably know, after my last talk, I modeled central Minnesota in 1956, and it's basically prototypically accurate layout centered around St. Cloud. And I first learned about the spur when I saw it listed on timetables and some condensed profiles. And so I started digging into it a little bit, and actually start finding some photos that seemed like an interesting area to learn more about and possibly model. And then also years ago, I joined the Stearns County Historical Society, and they actually had a publication. One of their publications described some meatpacking plants, and they were located at the at the end of the spur. And so I thought that'd be kind of interesting if there's actually an opportunity to add some meatpacking to St. Cloud. But basically, say this is the area modeling the Osseo line, the line to Willmar, and the spur actually starts south of St. Cloud and then it heads back north and ends actually inside the city limits. Why was I interested? It packs a lot into a small area. So in the time period I model, there were 2 meatpacking plants, a coal-fired power plant, hydroelectric power plants, the pole yard, and a propane gas plant. I see that in here is the coal-fired plant. There's actually 2 hydroelectric plants, the propane plant, 1 meatpacking plant in here, 2nd meatpacking plant here, and they're all served with 1 turnout, the spur track and the 1 turnout at the end of a 3-mile, basically 3-mile spur. So I thought that could make for some very interesting operations. You don't need to create switching puzzles. The railroad actually had them on their own, and it was actually served by a local switcher out of St. Cloud. So I started to learn a little bit more about it, and as I started digging in, I found more photos and maps, and I started researching the AFE files at Jackson Street Archives, and learned a lot more. And so this presentation is basically made up of materials I've gotten from the AFE files, photos and information I found at the Minnesota Historical Society, and then photos and articles from local papers and other information that was collected at the Stearns County History Center. So the first mention of the Tileston Mill spur was actually in the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba GM series AFEs. It was AFE number 123. Unfortunately, we don't have any of those AFEs. I don't know if they existed anywhere or what, but all we have is the index. And the AFE was to authorize construction of a 15,300 foot spur track going down to the dam. The total cost was just over $26,000. But basically, it was a 3-mile spur coming off the main line. We don't really have much other information, so it's difficult to know exactly what was built on the AFE, but based on changes made later in other maps I found, I think we have a pretty good idea. And so this is the earliest map I could find, and it dates back to 1903, showing the northern or Railroad West end of the spur. At this point, it was named after the mill here, Tileston Mill. There's an additional track here, which we'll talk about a little later, that was not there originally because I found the AFE when this track was added.
Rich, if you're trying to pinpoint something, we're not seeing
Yep.
your the pointer.
Sorry, it wasn't turned
There
up.
we
It
are.
was showing up in my computer, but it wasn't showing up on, yeah, yep,
That works.
yep,
Thank
sorry
you.
about that.
Hey, no
So,
worries.
yeah.
Thank you.
So right here is the mill at the end of the spur. This track right here is actually to a lumber company, and that was not part of the original construction because, as I'll show you a little bit later, there's an AFE for this right here. So from what I can tell at this end, the spur simply came down and served the mill right here. And it didn't show, the initial map didn't show much else in the area outside of this mill. Although I have a feeling that the one power plant was already there. Otherwise, why would they have this canal if this power plant wasn't there? So let's talk Tileston Mill. It was built in 1888 by George Tileston. You notice he didn't live that much longer. We'll talk about that in a second. It was a pretty good sized mill for the time. The capacity was 1,000 barrels of flour per day. Actually, George Tileston was actually also a director for the St. Cloud Water, Light and Power Company. And I think that's how he probably got permission to build the mill there, because the main hydroelectric plant was located at the end of the canal. Unfortunately, George died tragically, drowning in the mill's canal. All the stories agree that his horse became spooked, and as he was heading home from the mill, and he was trying to go through the narrow area between the track and the canal on a carriage, and the horse got spooked and jumped into the middle of the canal, taking the carriage and George with it. Unfortunately, George couldn't swim and he drowned in the canal. Some of the stories say there was lightning that spooked the horse. Another one said actually that there was no lightning, but something he said or did that spooked it. But anyway, he tragically died. And unfortunately, not having him around probably led to some issues later that might not have been if he'd been around. But the mill was sold by the family in 1914 and became the Great Northern Milling Company. So this is a picture of the mill sometime after 1908. This is another photo I found showing the mill and the elevator. The elevator was actually built a little later, and we'll talk about that. The other industry, which I think I've not been able to find any AFEs showing this track being added, so I have a feeling it was part of the original AFE, was the Hess Brickyard. And this is the other end of the spur where it comes off the main line, and there's a little double-ended spur serving the brickyard. Now, in that area, there are several valuable beds of brick clay in the St. Cloud area. What was a little bit unique is that instead of the normal brick color, the clay produced cream-colored bricks. And that's why to this day, you'll see a lot of houses and buildings in the St. Cloud area with the yellow brick. So Henry Hess and a partner purchased the brickyard in 1882. Then he switched partners and became Hess and moved in 1886. This is a photo of the main building around 1900. But they were producing about 2 million bricks a year, and most of that shipping on the GN. Found this nice photo of them loading box cars. Look at that's a Eastern of Minnesota, but also already says Great Northern. See, it's only a 33-foot long car. So this is the type of cars that were around there at the time. And of course, everything was loaded by hand. So they actually averaged 1.5 carloads of brick per day. Unfortunately, the business declined after Henry Hess died. Basically, successors weren't as experienced. They made poor quality bricks. So a couple of years after he died, the business shut down because of poor quality bricks. This is a photo from about 1935 showing the remnants of the brickyard at that time, the kilns, and some of the remnants of the buildings. So then the next AFE I found was still a Manitoba one, created back in 1893, and that was AFE 785, but that's the one that authorized construction of a 350-foot spur track for Bridgman's planing mill. It had a grand cost of $246. So that was this spur right here. That's when that was built. So there was actually a number of lumber yards there. This is the only photos I've been able to find of Bridgman's lumber mill. This one here is before, this is actually even before the elevator was put in, from 1876. And you can see the mill in the background. They added the spur when they put actually a large planing mill. And if you blow up the photo of the Tileston Mill, you can see the planing mill building right here. And so I know at one point, you'd hear about them floating logs down the river. And there's actually some other lumber mills on the other side of the river. What I found out, though, in this case, they actually started hauling logs down there, because the next reference I could find was in a AFE dated 1902. In November, actually it started back in October, on October 20th, and they were authorizing them to install 2,896 tie plates on sharp curves. The mill had some fairly sharp curves. They said they had 3,800 feet of curves that were 3% or sharper. And as they were replacing ties, the wood was soft. And apparently they said there was an increase in traffic, and there was heavy log trains delivering logs to the end of the spur. So they must have been delivering the logs to the planing mill. And basically, because of these heavy trains and a lack of tie plates on the curves, the track was spreading, causing problems. So they actually authorized them to go back and put in tie plates to try to keep these heavy trains from spreading the rails. Now it ends up that, with the AFEs, well, there's a process where you're supposed to have everything approved before you start the work, but at times, as we'll see, the AFE was more of a paper exercise afterwards, because when you look down through the paperwork, they say, well, the work's authorized, and then somebody writes a letter saying, well, we actually did the work. This is just to justify the money they spent. So in spite of the process, local people would tend to do whatever it took to keep the trains running and keep the traffic moving safely, and then kind of beg for forgiveness afterwards. So now we're up to 1908, and that's when the Tileston Mill constructed their new elevator. And basically at this point, they asked, the Great Northern to install a 190-foot stub track to serve the elevator. Now, the initial correspondence was regarding rebuilding the bridge across the canal leading to the mill. What I find interesting is, even back in these days, you can see a cyclone here and things to collect dust. And that was back about 1915. So this shows the in the red here is where they wanted to add a track to serve the elevator. Now, one thing that's interesting is that by this point, the map shows 2 tracks serving the mill. And if remember in those photos, there were 2 rows of boxcars, yet I haven't been able to find any reference to when the second track was built. So here's a close-up of the map. And you see, like I say, note there's 2 tracks there which were never described. It was added sometime since the 1902 map. The other thing that's interesting is, on future AFEs, when they wanted to take out this track or make other changes, they said right in there that there was no history of these 2 tracks. Normally, In most cases, for instance, with this track here, the railroad build the track, but then the industry would be assigned ownership of it and charged for the cost of it. And they'd have legal agreements, yet in this case, they said there was no documentation or agreements could be found governing these two tracks when they were put in and who paid for it. Also, if you look at this, you'll see this already now has the hydroelectric plants shown on here, yet I'm sure that this one here was actually here much earlier. And here's actually some photos of the hydroelectric plant I found that were right next to it. So, the bridge controversy, part one. The mill had actually asked the railroad to ideally they wanted a new double track bridge so they could serve the elevator from the same direction. Well, the public service company insisted on, said, we don't want a trestle bridge anywhere because that's going to obstruct our water flow to our hydroelectric plant. So I said, initially, George Tileston was part of the board. And I'm sure that's how he was able to put his plant and use some of the water. But without him there was no friendly relationship. And the railroad said, basically, we're not willing to put in a steel bridge to serve this little spur. It's going to be way too expensive. So on the other hand, it was also, the bridge is starting to get a little unsafe. And so what the railroad finally said, look, we'll put in this spur track here, but even if they could run engines across, there was no runaround on the spur to go around it. So this was designed so that the railroad would push the car's heat down onto this track. And then the milling company would need to use a car hauler to manually pull the cars in front of the elevator. And that was the compromise that was made in order to put the spur in. Bridge controversy, part two. By 1915, the bridge was in very sad shape. You can see the outline here. There's some trestles and there was a wooden how truss bridge. The correspondence indicates there was, in 1914, they wanted to rebuild it, but by this point, it was Union Power Company owned the canal. They had stopped the work because they said there's too much obstruction in the canal. But the bridge was so unsafe that the railroad couldn't actually run an engine across it. They were worried that a string of cars could fall right through it. And it was unsafe for switch engines. So they had to have a handle of 4 or 5 cars at a minimum to switch the mill because they couldn't run an engine over it. And even though they made some temporary repairs the previous year, they showed that the actual bridge was deflecting 1 1/8 to 1 3/4 inches every time a small switch engine went over it. So it's at that point is that, they couldn't run equipment over it. So they went back to the canal and got initial agreement on a bridge design that they would deem acceptable. Of course, what happened then? In February of 1915, the mill caught on fire. And if you look at, right in here, there was not much left of it. So initially the railroad thought, well, that ends the issue about the bridge, but actually within just a week after the fire, the Great Northern Milling Company sent a letter stating that they planned to rebuild the mill and asked the GN to build a double track bridge to simplify switching.
Rich,
Yes?
that seems awfully coincidental that the reason for a new bridge, which is argued against by the hydro, you know where I'm going, right?
Yeah.
I mean, is there any suspicion, any mention that that was arson?
No, nope, because they did rebuild it. They rebuilt the mill right where it was. All they were asking for, as long as we're rebuilding it, can you make the track so it's less expensive, easier to switch?
No, I mean, is there any chance that the power company
Or the power?
set fire?
I don't know. I mean, let's put it this way. In any of the articles I saw that talked about things, there was no ever mention that it was considered arson. And actually, if you look, there's other mills in the area. And in those days, there was a lot of mill fires. They didn't have the intrinsic safety requirements, and a lot of mills burned down fairly often in those days.
All right, thanks.
Yep. But no, I said there wasn't anything about it being suspicious in anything I've read. So, you go on, it gets interesting because lawyers and other people started getting involved. So the Union Power Company said at some point they're gonna build concrete walls leading to their plant. And so they wanted concrete abutments at the end of the bridge. Then the GN said, well, we'll put in concrete abutments once you put in the concrete walls, but until then it's going to be a trestle. Next thing you know, Union Power Company is insisting that, look, the whole canal is our property. You don't have you have no proof and you're trespassing on our property, and remove the bridge. Then there's letters from the company lawyers claiming, well, we've had the bridge in there for 15 years, and so that gives us title by adverse possession. So it's just amazing how often lawyers were involved in AFEs in those days. So they finally made an agreement, and the canal agreed to allow the bridge for two things. One is to raise the bridge so it's higher, so they could have higher water flows than before. And the second was to limit the cross section of the piles to 12 inches. So they finally completed the new bridge in 1916, but it stayed a single track trestle bridge. So the mill didn't get their way. It was, the track arrangement stayed the same, but they did raise the bridge. Of course, that causes the next set of problems, which is, raising the bridge. So in 1916, they had to create another AFE to raise the track to match the new bridge height. And at the same time, they was asked to move the track, separate them some for 13-foot centers for the wider cars. And the problem was they raised the bridge. Actually, at the track at the bridge was actually 2 feet higher than before, but they didn't do much with the approaches. They're saving money, so they just use cinders to drop that 2 feet quickly on either side of the bridge, but that made it difficult to spot cars since they were rolling. So now they had to go back in and build everything up and raise the tracks, which led to the track scale controversy. So when they raised the track at the mill, the track scale had to be raised. The mill came back and sent a bill to the GN for all the costs associated with rebuilding their scale and putting in a new scale. GN comes back with letters saying that they raised the track at the request of the mill owners, and that their part of raising the bridge didn't interfere with the scale. Well, it ends up the scale had been condemned by the state because it was too old and inaccurate. So the mill had to install a new Fairbanks Morse scale. And they thought this was their chance to get the railroad to pay for their new scale. And so they actually hired an attorney to file a case against the GN, but the GN was able to show that no, that they were in the right, and that they were basically replacing a defective mill, and anything the GN did wouldn't have changed the fact. Even if they left the tracks or whatever, had never moved the bridge, the scale was condemned, and that finally ended it. But it's just amazing how many years some of the correspondence on these things could go on, and how just simple things of moving a track. Well, let's put this way, lawyers made a lot more money off of the railroads in those days than I'd realized. So then the next major AFE was in 1916 at the request of St. Cloud Water Company. So the company was giving the GN so much grief initially over the bridge, and now wanted the GN's help. And actually, you can also see they changed their name again. Now it's the St. Cloud Water Power Company. But this plant right here, as you can see, they added a coal-fired plant to the water plant. And that's probably why they changed their name from the water power company to the St. Cloud Public Service Company. And actually you can see, well, I think this is before, this is just when the roadway's there, but you can see now there's a stack at this plant. And so basically the power company was charged $880, but this spur was put in place. And of course, the AFE had just been approved when, what was it, August 23rd. The power company is now saying on September 1st to please build a spur faster, because we're going to be shipping in heavy machinery for the plant in 3 weeks. So we need the spur in place to move the equipment. Yeah. The next controversy that came up was the Butler Brickyard. So all the way back on June 21st, 1911, Ernest Butler requested the GN build a spur to his brickyard. So his brickyard was located just on the opposite side of the main line from the Hess Brick and Tile Works. And they requested a 2,100-foot spur. And the whole issue was is that he claimed he was an economic advantage because he was paying 60 cents per 1,000 bricks for drayage to GN box cars, while his competitors were served by rail directly. And he had a capacity, as they said, a capacity of 2.5 million bricks per year, but we're only producing 1.5 million bricks because they were having problems shipping it. So what they actually had to do was transport their bricks to the siding in front of the Hess Brickyard in order to load up the cars. And so the traffic department recommended they grant the application, but the Great Northern ended up denying the request because of the cost from their end, for the trackage on their property, and also adding a switch to the main line. So when some of the correspondence says that the Osseo line was getting busy at the time, and they didn't want to put another turnout or switch on the main line, and their claim was that the existing Hess spur was actually off of the Tileston Mill spur, so having it there didn't affect the main line. It was being switched off the spur. So after years of going back and forth and delay, Butler actually requested a hearing at the Railroad and Warehouse Commission. And so on September 13th, 1916, a formal hearing was held with lawyers from both sides, representing their clients. And the Railroad and Warehouse Commission ruled that the GN must construct a spur track by no later than June 1st, 1917. Butler was supposed to do the grading, which he'd offered to do in the first place and pay $1,500. And so they approved an AFE to create the spur. And the other question was, this was the initial path they planned on taking on the spur, but they ended up designing a longer spur that came off the main line back here, came along this way to eliminate the spur having to cross the main road here. Oops. So the spur was constructed in 1917, and they actually, if you see, there's actually a second little spur added at the end to serve their facility. Then in 1920, the Catholic Orphanage requested a 600-foot spur. At this point, they're always under the USRA control, so the letters and even the AFE forms were USRA and GN together. And they're planning on building a large orphanage, which would require 125 carloads of material. So of course, they wanted the spur at once. But then they also said that the track would be required permanently to handle coal for the power plant. And the orphanage agreed to do the necessary grading. So you can see the orphanage here. But you can even see like the fence here, the orphanage is up on the bluff. Here's the spur coming in off the river down below. So they proved an AFE in 1920. The total cost was about $2,100. The orphanage was charged $1,390, and it was built in finished in May 12th, 1920. And this shows the spur coming off the main line. You look at those costs back then, and you look at things in the hundreds of dollars or $1,000 or $2,000. You see over time, things did get much more expensive. So this shows the Tileston Mill spur in 1921. And this is about as complex as the spur got. You had the initial turnout here, 2 turnouts for the Hess Brickyard, the turnout and the track for the orphanage, the track to the NSP plant. The Bridgman Mill spur was still in there. They had the 2 tracks and then the switchback spur on the elevator at the Great Northern Milling Company. So we've kind of seen, and let's say here's the close-ups again, the Bridgman spur, the spur to the coal yard and the Tileston Mill. So this is as complex as the trackage ever got. Of course, a few years later, here's another AFE, this time requesting the railroad remove the spur to St. Otto's Orphanage. Ends up the orphanage didn't use the spur for coal shipments. What they found out was, and they should have realized up front, there's a very steep hill from that spur up to the orphanage. And it was very expensive to unload coal and haul it up. It was actually cheaper for them to buy their coal and have it unloaded in the team track in town and hauled out to the orphanage where it was flat versus paying to lift all that coal up the grade at the orphanage. And so that was approved in 1925, April 24th, 1926, the work was completed. Well, when you look at the correspondence, now you start seeing letters going back and forth between the archdiocese and the railroad, because the archdiocese is reminding the railroad, wait a minute, we had to pay when you put the spur in. Now that you took it out, there's scrap value in that rail and the ties, and we want, you owe us the scrap value for whatever you took out and salvaged it. And eventually the railroad did refund the orphanage for the scrap value. But that's kind of interesting looking at letters from the archdiocese and and the archbishop asking the railroad to refund them for the scrap value of rail and railroad ties and spikes. And of course, when Butler put the track in, you look at the hearings and things, they talked about having enough clay there to last 40 or 50 years. Yet here we are in 1930, and there's an AFE to remove all the trackage at the Butler Brick and Tile Works. So there's been basically no revenue for the past few years, no future prospects. And even the industry said, we can't use, we're not going to use the track. We're not going to be shipping anymore. So their justification was to not only save maintenance expense, but they wanted to use the recovered materials elsewhere. This was, again, a paper exercise because the track had been taken out. It ends up the track was taken out November 29th, except for the ties, few of which were of any value. Yet here they are in October 1930, doing the paperwork to adjust the books for the rail they took out. The other interesting thing I found is, I don't know if they built it different than the drawings or if they modified it over time. But remember, before there was a second little spur at the end, and at the time they were removing it, there was a spur partway up the line instead. So I don't know, and I have not found any records of any changes being made. So maybe when they built it, they made changes over the initial drawings. So that ends the early years. So we kind of saw it at its peak and already some things disappearing. The middle years were actually primarily a time of change where a lot of the existing things were disappearing and the spur became very simple. So in 1933, they actually did another basically paper AFE. Apparently 3 years earlier, they'd removed some of the trackage at the end of the Bridgman spur just to permit construction of another building. And so at some point they need to make the books balance out. So they did an AFE, and the AFE had a credit of $11 for salvaged material. So you end up looking at the files of the amount of work that was done just to straighten out the books by a very small amount, but they were very meticulous. Whether the work was done years ahead earlier or approval, they're figuring things out to the penny, the scrap value, the labor, and transferring costs between the books. And actually, in 1934, the city of St. Cloud acquired the mill and the elevator and basically made an agreement with the public service company who'd owned the land. So the public service company had always owned the land that the mill was built on, but ends up the taxes on the land and building hadn't been paid since 1924. And since the public service company leased the land, they were liable for the taxes for the land. And so basically they agreed to give the billings to the city and to pay the back taxes on the land. And the city would wipe out the unpaid taxes on the structures is if they gained ownership. And it ends up in there, it says that the milling company hadn't done any business in 10 years. So, but apparently by 1924, the milling company had shut down and the buildings were there. And so what happened at the time was the reason why the city wanted it was they wanted the timber, the lumbers, and the galvanized coverings from the mill and the elevator, and they used those materials on a bunch of new city projects. So they had this tax liability and used that as a reason to gain ownership and gain a bunch of materials that they could use for other things. And about the same time, the public service company, and I don't know if it was Northern States Power Company, which is still in existence, one of the major power companies in the area, although it's now called Xcel Energy. If they acquired, they probably must have acquired it because they were acquiring other power companies, and they became the new owners of the land. So in 1934, an AFE was written to remove the Bridgman Spur here and Tileston Spurs number 2 and 3, which were the track closest to the mill and the elevator, leaving one track here at the Tileston Mill. NSP had requested removal of the trackage, and they're also the ones that took legal steps to compel the removal of the mill buildings. So like, that's why all this kind of happened. There's the city then, took over the buildings, and these tracks were taken out in 34. So now we're down to this track serving the coal-fired plant and one track crossing the bridge onto the island. And again, by this point, there is no longer an Orphanage spur either. So in 1939, due to the condition of the replacement bridge, it couldn't be used anymore. So it was unsafe. And at this point, there was no mill there or anything. And so basically, instead of replacing the bridge, it was proposed to remove the track and the bridge. NSP said it was fine for them to remove the track and bridge over the canal. So they approved an AFE in March to remove it. However, this case, they were slow getting around to remove it. And on November 20th, the letter was sent from NSP saying they're going to be building a new power plant there, and the bridge and trackage were required. So in this case, being slow helped, and the AFE was canceled. And this is the major power plant that was built in 1941. They built an entirely new coal-fired plant on the site of the former mill. And actually, this required a couple things. It required rebuilding the bridge, and it required moving the spur track. Here's one of the things I found interesting is I found this photo at the Minnesota Historical Society showing, and it's kind of interesting, you can see the dam, water-powered mill, water-powered electric power plant, the coal-fired plant, the other hydroelectric plant, the coal-fired plant they built next to it, and in the background, a large propane tank. And initially, NSP had a propane or a gas generating plant in the city of St. Cloud. And at some point, they moved the tank down here. But when you blow up this photo, here you can see, what's bringing in the coal? It's a string of Great Northern gondolas. You can see when I blow it up even farther, you can see the goat herald. So they were using gondolas, drop bottom gondolas, to bring the coal into the power plant. And here was actually a little unloading area here where they could dump the gondolas. So it's like, okay, now there's another source of traffic and another use for gondolas for the plant. So in 1940, they approved an AFE to move the spur track over to match up with the new plant from this location to that location, and to put in a new bridge. The total cost was $2,135, and $600 was billed to NSP. But this is a nice aerial view. You can see here's where they would unload the cars for the coal pile. See a large substation here, and the coal-fired plant and the water-powered plants. They actually extended this track down here so they could bring in other equipment if they needed transformers or other things. And then just up in this area here is where they had the pole yard to store poles for the electric company. And this actually found drawings of the new bridge. In this case, they actually made it long. Became a longer bridge with 4 bents on it, but try to keep the cross section small. So this started generating more traffic on the spur. At the same time, in 1940, they requested an AFE to remove 150 feet of the west end of the Hess Brickyard spur, including the turnout. So this was, remember, this was double-ended. And what they asked was to remove the turnout and this end of the spur. And the reason for it is it hadn't been used in years, but this particular turnout was located in a public crossing. There was a road going right through here. And so that was causing maintenance headaches for the Great Northern and the road. And so they wanted to take the turnout out of there so they could save the maintenance costs. And so that was approved on June 3rd, 1940. As you see over the next few slides, is they weren't really doing a lot of planning at the time. So they were kind of just handling things one small project at a time. So here it is, June 30th, 1940, they remove this turnout, this end. They say they haven't been using the west end of the track for years. The next AFE was for installing a car puller for the new power plant to pull the cars, but where they wanted to attach the cable sheave was on the bridge, so they had to strengthen the bridge. And so NSP granted permission for them to install it, and they paid for all the expenses, but they had to change the trainman's walk, move the fence, and place a block and timber for the car puller to pull cars back and forth underneath the unloading area. So they put a new bridge, and within less than a year, we're modifying it. The next AFE was to move a telephone and phone box booth from the Empire Quarry Spur to the Tileston Mill Spur. And basically, the justification was they're starting to deliver a large amount of coal at the new power plant, which is taking a bunch of switching. And the problem is it's 3.5 miles out to the spur, and they needed the phone booth for the safety of the switch crews to save for delays, but to provide safety because 3.5 miles out. And remember, we're going 3.5 miles on the main line, but then they're going down 3 miles and they have no idea what's passed on the main line in between. And so the AFE was there to provide a phone booth right here so the crews could call in and make sure that it was clear and safe for them to return back to the yard from the spur. So even though it's kind of the war years, they were fairly busy. But like I said, remember in 40, they removed one end of the spur. In 41, they did an AFE to remove this length, the whole length of track and this turnout. At this point, they said no industry is located on the spur and hadn't been used for 10 years. Remember, the brick plant died in 33. Don't know why they didn't do this the same time they removed this turnout, because there'd never been an industry there. And again, it was for maintenance expense. But again, with any time you were taking out a spur, and maybe this is why they delayed, they could take out this turnout on their own. To remove a spur track means lawyers had to get involved and get permission from the Minnesota Railroad and Warehouse Commission. So 1941, they proved in 41, early 42, they removed this spur. The next AFE in 42, the spur turnout was here and parallels the main line and curves away. Now we're in the middle of World War II and steel rail is in shortage. So they did an AFE basically to take this turnout, move it to here, and eliminate this section of the spur because they needed steel rail for use in other locations. And so they spent $175 to get a salvage value of $250 because they needed rail and you couldn't get it during the war. So a lot of AFE, a lot of work to basically reduce maintenance and to save rail and spikes and tie plates for use in other locations. So now we get to the last section in the life of the spur, and that's St. Cloud Meatpacking. So there's Donovan's Real Sausage Company was making sausage in St. Cloud, and the owner, John Donovan, decided to expand to the meatpacking business. So he started St. Cloud Meatpacking, and they built a new plant in 1947. Ends up, he sold the controlling interest to Andrew Nutzling in 48. Well, although his controlling interest, Donovan was involved with it till his death in 65. After Donovan died, Nutzling sold the business and became Robel Packing Plant. But in my time period, it was still St. Cloud Meatpacking. And the plant was built down along the river. And this shows a view of the plant in 1957. And basically, here's one of the AFEs that shows the plant. And what's interesting is this was a stock. Here's one of the buildings. There was a stock loading plant. Here's another pen. If you see at the end of this pen, there's a loading chute right along the spur to load cattle. So they had two buildings and a couple of pens. This ramp here is actually for trucks. I'm going to point this out now, but there'll be another AFE coming up to put in this spur. And what they ended up having to do is cut off. They had to get agreement with the plant to be able to cut out the corner of this pen to put the spur track in. But from this, it's clear they were receiving some of their cattle. And this is actually an aerial view in 69 where you can see the propane plant. Here's where the spur track was going, and here's by this point, this pen plant or pens were no longer there, and the plant here had been expanded. But right about here is where this original ramp would have been. At the same time, there was another meatpacking business, and Bert Landy bought it from the Huntsingers. Landy actually owned grocery stores in Minneapolis and was looking for a source of meat. So he bought this meatpacking business in 1936. But the two guys who joined him as partners couldn't get along, and he bought in April of 36, and by November of 1936, they closed the business because of fighting between the partners. 9 years later, Max Landy, the son, reopened the business with his father in 1943. They built a small plant, but it burned to the ground a few years later due to an explosion from ammonia fumes. They used ammonia in the refrigeration. So they rebuilt, and they've rebuilt right on the line. And this facility ended up growing large enough that at one point they were slaughtering 1,000 heads of cattle a day, which made them the 42nd largest meatpacking plant in the country. Now, this was in St. Cloud. This is a view from 1969. And I had a chance to talk to somebody that worked out of St. Cloud on the GN and in this area, and he actually talked to one of the switchmen and gave me more information. But he said that the box cars, one of the reasons they used the box cars was for loading hides, and they had an old 1-ton truck that they'd load the hides on in the plant, drive them out to the cars and load them. The tank cars were used for fats and byproducts. They had pipes from the plant running over to load those. And actually, I'll show you on the drawing a little bit, there was actually a ramp right here to unload stock, and then they just have to herd them from here into the pens. So you can see, at this point in 69, there's 5 cars here all lined up to serve the plant. Yet this isn't a siding. This is just actually the Tileston Mill spur coming down, and they're just parked alongside the spur.
Rich?
Yes.
How, it's hard to tell from the, excuse me, from the pictures and stuff, but how many feet was the elevation of the plant above the river? I mean, isn't the river prone to flooding pretty much every spring?
Well, there's that dam just upstream of it.
Oh, that's right. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah. So no, it's not very high. Matter of fact, if you look at the chart, the track was lower here than at the very end. The track actually went up a little bit to go on the bridge and onto the island with the canal with the power plant. So, but I think it's this is all built, it's a downstream of a dam. And I have never heard about it being flooded. By the way, here you see foundations going in, and we'll talk about this in just a minute. So in 48, NSP requested a spur, which we talked about, for their new gas generation plant. And I've got photos actually of them tearing down the old plant in the city. And basically what they expected to handle was 150 to 200 cars of propane gas per year, which would generate between $9,000 and $12,000 in revenue for the railroad for hauling the cars in and out. And so the total cost was $5,110, of which the NSP would pay $3,865. So they approved the AFE on the 21st. Again, this is, take a little time to go through, but the traffic department requested them to hurry it up because all those propane tanks you see here were going to be arriving by rail in October. And so they needed the spur in to be able to bring in the equipment to build the plant. And so this shows the facility about a year later. The old tank was still there, but there's a series of new ones. And this building was the kind of propane plant. So then by 1950, they're no longer using this coal-fired, using this coal-fired plant with the new one running. And NSP asked them to take out this trackage because they needed to put in a new building here on block 20. And what the new building was is actually a new substation. So again, lawyers have to get involved because even though the customer is asking the track to be removed, everything has to go through the Minnesota Railroad and Warehouse Commission. And so NSP actually in this case paid money to help get it to get the track taken out. It was approved in 1950, and this actually shows in March 1551 is the field report showing that it had been removed. So there wasn't much in the later years. In 55, though, a person owned land on both sides of the spur asked the Great Northern to remove 3,669 feet of right-of-way fencing because he wanted to beautify the property because they're going to put in a housing project. And it ends up the Great Northern had been paying Mr. Braun the sum of $20 each year to put snow fence along the track. And so Braun said, look, I won't charge you $20 a year for putting snow fencing up on my land if you get rid of the right-of-way fencing so it can make things look pretty and then sell this land for houses. Now, would I want houses close to a meatpacking plant? That's another question, but anyhow, the FE was approved in 1955. This is actually a picture from 65, kind of showing where things are at, and you can see the stacks are gone, so the water plant is still here, the coal-fired plant, water plant. This is the St. Cloud State University, which has been expanding. The propane plant's here, but this large the large tank is gone, and you can still see the buildings from the first meatpacking plant right here. This is one of the maps I found. This map was actually sent to me by the former GN employee, and I can't quite date it. Somewhere in the late 60s, because it's got only the one spur left. That even the one to the propane plant was gone. But it doesn't have the additional spur that was put in 1970 for the meatpacking plant. So at this point, it was very simple, just a spur going to the coal-fired plant and the meatpacking plants along it. And so the last AFE I could find was in actually 1970, and they requested 335-foot spur be built to serve a new warehouse for the meatpacking company. And by this point, just a 335-foot spur cost $8,000 to put in, of which $3,045 was for the part on the Landy's land. You'll also notice that, and this was put in the mid-50s, they had the city water treatment plants were put in. So you still had Landy here, you still had St. Cloud meatpacking, and in between them was these sludge beds and a water treatment plant. So for operations, we're fortunate that we have a series of dispatcher train sheets from the 1960s, and this just gives a sample. And actually, I was able to blow it up, and you can see it. With all of the cities, they actually list the Tileston Mill spur on the sheet, and that's because of the train. So you can see, like, here's an engine 78, and leaving on this side, arriving on this side. So it left at 2:35 with 7 loads and 2 empties, and it returned at 5:15 with 2 empties. So I've had a chance to go through a series of these sheets to try to figure out some patterns. And basically SW1 number 78 was the most frequently used engine. On some occasions, they used NW3 number 177. Bergmeyer was the usual conductor on almost all the runs. I found Nettle on some of the other runs. Graft and Bergmeyer used to work together, and typically they'd spend part of the day switching here and part of the day switching granite quarries west of St. Cloud. But there are several other engineers that showed up in the sample that I took. But the times did vary. I mean, here's just a listing of different days. 9 till 10:30 in the morning, 11 till 12:45, 4 to 7, 11:40 to 2:10, 9 to 11, 2 to 5. So it wasn't done at a consistent time. Like I say, I did get some information passed over from Robert Skillenstad, who was a former switchman. He says, he definitely remembers. I thought maybe they had the cattle unloading spurs, but did they ever do it? He says, no, he remembers spotting cattle at the Landy ramp and also at the other packing company. Couldn't remember the name, but that would have been the St. Cloud Packing. So they definitely did bring cattle down. I see no evidence of refrigerator cars ever coming out, but it looks like they brought cattle down at times. There's a lot of it, most of it came in by truck because you can just see a lot of trucks there. But then there's also box cars of hides and tank cars of waste products coming and going from that area. And I have added the Tileston Mill spur to my layout. It's the last thing going in. It comes off the main line in the utility area, comes down around. So I will have Landy packing here, St. Cloud meat packing here. In this area is where we'll be having the pole yard, the propane plant, and then the coal unloading. So the only thing in my case, I had to tuck the line underneath the main line because the main line curves out into another room. The thing I'm doing is use the power plant buildings and the substations will end up showing up on the back drops, and so I just don't have. It's a lot of depths required to put the buildings in. But again, one spur, but there'll be quite a bit of traffic: coal, propane cars, loads of poles, stock cars, box cars, and tank cars with very limited space to switch. And like in the prototype, you have no idea, what traffic's in here. So they'll have to call the dispatcher from the phone booth here to find out if the main line's clear. With that, I just want to give special thanks to the Minnesota Historical Society and Stearns County Museum for the help from finding all the photos and information. And then thank you to Roger Brewster. He contacted actually Chaz Bettendorf, who passed them over to me, knowing I'm interested in the area. And Rogers has sent me a number of maps, industry guides, and information on what was there and how it was switched, and even talked to some of the switchmen to give me some more information. So it's been very, very helpful. With that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rich. That was a wonderful presentation. Enjoyed it thoroughly. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I have to agree. And there's been a lot of comments already that it's been a great presentation. Thanks for putting it up and getting together and showing all of this stuff. I do have one question, and I think it's a little bit tongue in cheek. Ron Farrell was asking, are you going to model the odor of the hide loading cattle pens, etc.?
Only accidentally. The reason I'm laughing is right now before I told my wife, one of the reasons I put that freezer or I put that shelf there was to put a safer place to put meat. Right underneath us, we have our freezer. And the other day I was taking inventory a couple of weeks ago, taking some stuff out of the freezer. And I ended up putting it over on the track on the right side where it disappears into the wall, a nice steak, T-bone steak. And I forgot it was there. And a few days later, I went downstairs and said, something's smelling down here. And we had our kids' dogs. I thought, did one of them have an accident? I'm looking all over. And I look on the floor and there's blood on the floor. And I look up and there's a very smelly, stale T-bone steak that totally thawed out.
Making its presence known.
Yes. And so now I have a bigger shelf there so I can always put the things right above so I won't miss it, hiding it behind the furnace on the track there. So not intentionally, but accidentally, that area does still smell a little bit like stale beef.
Yeah.
And you can't make this stuff up.
No.
Hello, Rich. This
Yeah.
is Roger Brewster.
Right.
It's very well presented. It's really interesting at Tileston Mill Spur.
Hide cars, once they were used for hides, were pretty much never used for anything else ever again.
Well, thanks for all of your help.
Thank you.
All right.
Are you saying goodbye?
Yep, thank you very much, Rich, and we are now at 12:01, so I'll stop recording.